Firstly, I find that it is far more theoretically virtuous to assume that reality is fundamentally unified, rather than fractured. So we should take the stance of metaphysical holism, such that, at bottom, reality's foundation is a simple, or non-composite, whole, rather than a collection of fundamental parts akin to metaphysical atomism, which entails that reality is fundamentally fractured. I think the idealist would agree with me. Let's analyze what that would be. The idealist believes it is some sort of fundamental subject, and in a sense I agree. However, there cannot be a subject without an object, nor an object without a subject. For example, in knowledge, the subject is the knower, and the object is the knowledge for the subject. There can be no knower without an object of knowledge, but there can neither be an object of knowledge without a knower. Now, it seems fairly intuitive that there is a real distinction between me, a particular subject, and any of my objects. In other words, me and my objects are really different entities, thereby rejecting the position that my objects are simply manifestations of me and are not distinct entities of their own, namely a position like existence monism. However, for the fundamental subject, this cannot be the case if it is to be an absolute unity, since any real distinctions would impart composition into it, which would require something non-composite to ground such composition, since again, reality is fundamentally unified and not fractured, where the existence of distinction and separation requires a unified ground. Now, since the idealist believes in a fundamental subject of sorts, and subjects imply knowledge, and knowledge implies objects, then this fundamental subject, or the absolute, has knowledge and objects of knowledge. Now, it follows from before that the subject and object in the absolute are the same reality. So there is no real distinction in being between these two. But if the absolute can be said to truly have knowledge, then there must be some kind of distinction remaining if it is not a real distinction in being. Since knowledge is essentially a relation, we can say that there is still a real relation between the subject and object in the absolute, in order to preserve real knowledge, and that these relations necessarily proceed from the simple essence of the absolute. This lack of a real distinction in being between subject and object in the absolute implies that the entirety of the absolute's knowledge is self-knowledge. And since this simple fundamental knower must be pure being itself, it is able to contemplate the infinite number of ways that being may be finite in virtue of knowing itself as pure being, which includes all possible propositions, universals, essences, etc. And so, we can conclude that the absolute is omniscient. However, there is one relation missing, the act. If there is subject and object, then there must be an act to serve as an intermediary. Since there cannot be a knower without an object of knowledge, and vice versa, there also cannot be a knower or object of knowledge without an act of knowledge. So the real relations proceeding from the absolute are subject, act, and object. Since the absolute is not composite, and there is no real distinction in being between the relations themselves must each be the fullness of the absolute. So they are subsistent relations. The absolute is God. The subject is the Father. The act is the Holy Spirit. And the object is the Son, or the Logos. They are each subsistent relations, as Thomists say, and are each fully God. Therefore, the idealist subscribes to the Christian notion of the Trinitarian God.